There are very few of us who lie awake at night worrying about the Amish.
That's a great way to start.
This is not an accident. Consider how we as atheists are constrained to talk about Islam. And Christians often complain that atheists balance, and the secular media generally, balance every discussion of Islam with a discussion of extremist Christianity. The usual mode is to say, well, they have their jihadists, but we have people who kill abortion doctors. Okay, I think our Christian neighbors, even the craziest of them, are right to be outraged by this pretense of even-handedness. The truth is that Islam is quite a bit scarier and more culpable for needless human misery at this moment than Christianity has been for a very, very long time. And we have to point this out. I mean, you might remember that Thomas Friedman recently wrote an op-ed from Iraq noticing that some Sunni militias were fighting alongside American troops against al-Qaeda, and he asked a Sunni militant why he was doing this, and the militant said that he had recently seen an al-Qaeda member decapitate an 8-year-old girl, and this convinced him that the American Crusader forces were the lesser of two evils. Now, okay, great. So even Muslims, even Sunni militants, can discern the line between ordinary crazy Islam and the utterly crazy, once it is drawn in the spilled blood of little girls. This is a basis for hope of sorts. But we have to be clear, unremittingly clear about what is on the other side of that line. I mean, this is what we and the rest of the civilized world and the semi-civilized world are facing. Utter religious lunacy and barbarism in the name of Islam with, I'm unhappy to say, some mainstream theology to back it up. To be even-handed, as we are constrained to be as atheists, when discussing the problem of Islam, is to misconstrue the problem. The refrain that all religions have their extremists is bullshit. All religions don't have these extremists. Some religions have never had these extremists. A recent poll in the UK showed that a third of young British Muslims say they want to live under Sharia law and think that anyone who leaves the faith should be put to death for apostasy. This is a third of British Muslims. 68% of British Muslims think that their neighbors who insult Islam should be arrested and prosecuted. 78% think that the Danish cartoonist should be brought to justice. These people do not have a clue about what constitutes a civil society. It seems to me that reports like this coming out of Muslim communities living in the West should concern us before anything else about religion concerns us.
Not enough minerals.
Well, who wants some? This better be good. SCV ready.
Do I get the same question? I don't mind.
Would you like to close with that?
On Sharia.
It really is. I find
No, okay. I like
question.
surprises. Well, Sharia just means law. I mean, all people say Sharia law are making an elementary mistake, and of course it's not the case that every thief has their hand lopped off in Muslim society, or every adulterer gets stoned. And I'm perfectly sure that's not just because it would diminish the labour force so radically, or so to speak, disable it. I think it's more because of something I've claimed to notice elsewhere, which is that religion is man-made. And so there are enormous discrepancies in how these things are promulgated and also how they are enforced. And most countries and societies come quite early and easily to the conclusion that their own religions are, in one form or another, not really practicable. They say, I mean, after all,
Not enough minerals.
in Saudi Arabia, a woman can't even drive a car, whereas in Iran she can vote, not for much, but she can, as much as a man can, let's say. Her vote can be stolen and degraded as much as her husband's or her brother. There's an infinite variation. I don't know. I can't shake what I saw once on the BBC from someone whose career in London I follow. I don't know if you know him. You wouldn't like him. Anjan Chowdhury. He's a very well-known noisemaker around London, complaining about secularism, Judaism, all this kind of thing, and he'd been in trouble with the law a few times, and was interviewed on BBC, went on about how nothing would change until the green flag of Islam was flying over Downing Street and Buckingham Palace and so forth. And was asked, I thought quite mildly by the BBC interviewer, said, well, if this is the way you feel about Sharia and about total Islamic rule, wouldn't you feel happier moving to a country where they already had it? And which is, a polite question, but a rather cheap one. But still, what didn't prepare me for the answer. Chowdhury looked straight at the guy and straight into camera and said, what makes you think this is your country? I thought it was a very good question. Now, why do you feel, I think I know partly what I feel, why do you feel it's necessary to affirm that? And of course a Muslim should learn the language, should obey the laws, should observe the customs and so on. Most immigrants don't feel they, so to speak, absolutely have to say that. The answer, I suspect, is that it's embarrassing to notice that in places like as far apart as Sweden and as Spain, there are groups of people who say their countries should be part of the caliphate and that that's why they've come here. And if it wasn't for those people, you wouldn't be in this position. So it seems to me that in order to be consistent, you should fear them and dislike them, find them morally and intellectually repulsive, at least as much as, if not more, than I do. And I don't say that you don't. But I do think that is the urgent priority. On the lady's question about where would be the best country to live if you were a Muslim and wanting to be a member of a sexual or gender minority, or I think she said female or homosexual. So hard to confuse.
Not enough energy.
Actually, the easiest place for you to live in that case would probably be, I was thinking about it while Professor Lamont was speaking, would probably be, this will be my closing statement, would almost certainly be either Bosnia-Herzegovina or Kosovo.
Not enough.
Culturally Muslim, democratic, open societies in southern and Balkan Europe that were saved from obliteration by the power of the United States, which has never had a word of thanks for what it did.
Research.
And which remains a secular country with a godless constitution.
That's a note on which we can end.
Which is the last best hope of humanity. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both. I hope it's been an enlightening evening.
Not enough energy.
SCV ready. Well, butter my baby.
And we are back. Christopher, you talked about the civil war in Islam. Talk about the role of religion as you see it in the conflict we are now involved
Not
in.
enough minerals.
Well, people attack the president for all kinds of things that he said or appeared to say about religion. But some of which have been rather ill-considered, including the statement that Islam is a religion of peace, which I would say was a statement that was non-true rather than untrue. The Christian churches, almost in their entirety, I believe, were opposed to the regime change in Iraq. So was the President's own church, the United Methodist Church, for example. It was very interesting to me to find how completely useless Christianity was in a struggle of this kind. It was awful to find that Christianity was a religion of peace, or at least of pacifism and of surrender. The church, as far as I know, has not endorsed any war as just since it supported General Franco's invasion of Spain to destroy the Spanish Republic with a Muslim mercenary army in the 30s on the side of Hitler. I think this is a wonderful occasion to discuss what the real value of religion and politics, international affairs, is. The difficulty for me is that while we are, in a sense, objectively committed to secularism for our own society and others, if you take, say, just the case of Palestine, American support has, and Israel, American support has up till now gone to the Wahhabi royal family that pumps out anti-Semitic propaganda and that was concealed by to Israeli settlements which were run by messianic fanatics who wouldn't be able to do this if it wasn't for American aid, and to extreme Christians, mainly in the United States, who hope that this conflict will bring on Armageddon in the apocalypse. So what is otherwise a perfectly soluble problem, division of Palestine between its Arab and Jewish inhabitants, is made impossible by monotheism.
No, it's made impossible.
Completely poisoned by it.
Well, that it may be poisoned by the fusion of monotheism with politics, and that's the issue. The issue is not the relevance of faith. The issue is the fusion of faith with political power, and this is something that...
Well, if you believe is Jesus coming back very soon is going to kill everyone who doesn't agree with him, how do you keep that out of politics?
Well, I think you have to develop...
The belief is political. I'm sorry, Andrew.
No, it's not. Belief can't... It is possible, and if you believe John Locke, I mean, maybe you don't, but it is possible and should be possible, in fact essential, given our human experience. Christianity is not innocent in this regard. The 16th and 17th centuries were religious wars. People were murdered in large numbers, and out of that experience, that some things you may believe in are still not so important they're worth killing other people for, came liberal democracy. Our very system of government came out of resistance to the power of religion in politics.
Absolutely.
And what we're fighting for in this war, and I wrote this just at the very beginning of this war, is the possibility of religion outside of politics. And when you read the Gospels, I think that the overwhelming message is exactly that. My kingdom is not of this world, our Lord said. And there is a distinction between what Caesar is and what I am. And the idea, I mean, I think that the idea that Muslims could create a warrior theology out of Islam is much less amazing than that Christianity might do such a thing. And I also believe that that kind of fundamentalism and zeal, in which you think your truth is so important, you should kill another person to save his soul, is as dangerous in this country as it is anywhere else. It's not gotten to the same lengths, but I see the same glint in the eye of someone like Jimmy Swaggart or Pat Robertson and some of the forces that this president is riding to victory on. And I worry. I do not want this to become a war between fundamentalist Christianity and fundamentalist Islam. It is a war between fundamentalist religion and liberal democracy. And I say that as a believing Catholic.
Well, it's a civil war also within the other monotheisms, and after all, more than half of American Jews and more than half of Israeli Jews have always favored a two-state solution that grants self-determination to the Palestinians. They just can't get their way because of this nutcase zealot minority.
We within the religious faiths
so
also have
there has to be a civil war within Judaism, if you like, and there is one going on in Islam very clearly, and they're trying to... The fascist side wants to... they want to export that war to where we live to try and win it, so they've really involved us in their war, and... it's not my province, Andrew, but the Christian churches can't seem to make up their mind whether we are fighting for our civilization or not, or whether we should feel guilty about existing.
Hierarchies.
To be continued.
Yes.
Which will be another hour. Andrew Sullivan, Christopher Hitchens, come on back.
Not enough minerals.
SCV ready. SCV ready. SCV ready.
Not enough minerals.
SCV ready.
This podcast is brought to you by Audible, the world's leading source of audiobooks. If you would like to support it, go to audibletrial.com/Sam Harris.
Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals.
SCV ready.
Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Okay, well, I'm going to do a Ask Me Anything podcast this time around. Now, as some of you know, I often set out to do these and then answer one question for 20 minutes or more and don't get very far. And I'm afraid that's what's going to happen this time around. I'll answer a few questions in a rather long-winded way, and then hopefully do some rapid-fire answers and get through many of the questions. I must say, I really appreciate the response I get whenever I go out for questions. I get hundreds. Honestly, I can't even read all of your questions, but I've read many of them, and
Bad news.
it's
Not
very hard
enough
to choose.
minerals.
I'll just work through
Not
them.
enough minerals.
But I also have to do a little housekeeping in this podcast, so I will start with that. First, I'm recording
Upgrade
this
complete.
podcast on New Year's Day, so Happy New Year, everyone. And
Not enough
I ended
minerals.
the year in contentious fashion.
Our not enough minerals.
I don't know why I use Twitter. If I treated Twitter the way I treat Facebook, I would never have any of these entanglements that I so often discuss with you. I would never notice what was being said about me or what sort of skirmishes I was being dragged into. And therefore I'd never be tempted to respond. So it's perhaps deserves some rethinking whether it's worth my paying attention. But I'll tell you in a moment, at least 2 of my upcoming guests are coming on the podcast simply because of some Twitter incident. So that's it's certainly interesting. It keeps me forever uncertain whether I should be using it.
Not enough.
But in any case, as for my upcoming guests, I have actually 3 of the guests coming up are coming up entirely as a result of Twitter. So you can figure out whether it's a blessing or a curse at this point.
Not enough
I'll
minerals.
soon be speaking with Jocko Willink, the Navy SEAL who was recently interviewed on Tim Ferriss's podcast first and then Joe Rogan's. And I encourage you to listen to both those interviews. That's literally 5 hours of interview with
Insufficient
Jocko.
Vespine
He's just a
gas.
fascinating guy. And I certainly would have always loved to have him on my podcast. And it occurred to me to reach out to him.
Not enough
except,
minerals.
I just heard literally
Upgrade.
5 hours of him on 2 of my
Not
friends'
enough
podcasts.
minerals.
And it just seemed
You gonna give me
sure
orders?
Add
what there
on
would be to
complete.
add to that conversation. And Jocko now has his own podcast. At Joe Rogan's insistence, he started
Not
a
enough
podcast
minerals.
immediately and is banging those out, and the guy is great. But, on Twitter, we got thrown together, and people were encouraging him to come on my podcast, and he said he'd be happy to do it, and so here we are. So I'll be speaking to him.
Not enough
in the coming
minerals.
moments. And I look forward to that. And I'll try to find a fundamentally new line through the conversation so that we can get to some of his insight and experience that he didn't
Additional
have a
supply
chance to
depots.
share with
Not
Tim
enough
and Joe,
minerals.
and that should be fun. I'll also be speaking with
Not enough minerals.
Scotty Reitz, who's a
Not enough minerals.
former SWAT operator, who's the lead weapons and tactics instructor for LAPD
Not
SWAT,
enough.
and
Insufficient
now
Vespine
trains
gas.
people in the use of firearms. And I'm going to talk to Scotty about violence and self-defense and firearms and gun control, and also what it's like to be a cop and misuse of force we've all seen of late from cops. Just to get into all the politically sensitive but interesting area.
Not enough
Scotty
energy.
would be a great person to do it with. Jocko and
Add-on
Scotty will come
complete.
close together, and that will be all that
Add-on
violence
complete.
on the Weekend
Not enough
podcast.
minerals.
I'll also be speaking with Mariam Namazi, the ex-Muslim reformer based in the UK, who many of you probably know. You've probably seen video of her. I've circulated video of her before. And this was also Twitter-born. There was an incident of what I considered friendly fire, where she went after me for what I think is a misunderstanding of my views on profiling.
Insufficient Vespine
I've
gas.
always thought Mariam was great, but she
Insufficient
more or less
Vespine
slammed
gas.
me as a bigot
Insufficient
as far as I could tell on
Vespine
Twitter. And
gas.
so I reached out to her, and she's agreed to come on the podcast, and we'll try to rectify that situation. I don't know whether or not we succeed. Mariam's is a voice you all should hear, and bring her
Research complete.
There was also another Twitter-born collision, not so friendly with fire,
Not enough.
with someone who I'd never heard of, a
Not enough
young Muslim,
minerals.
probably soon-to-be lawyer. He's getting his JD at Yale. He's a writer who wrote a truly withering
Not enough
book review
minerals. Additional.
in Salon
Not enough
about
minerals.
my book with Majid. And he hated the
Additional
book.
supply. Not enough energy.
Seems to hate Majid, but especially hates me. And hatred really isn't too strong a word. People were hurling this review at me on Twitter. I
Add-on
don't tend
complete.
to read Salon. So
Additional supply
anyway,
depots
I
required.
read it. Needless to say, I don't agree with it.
Additional upgrade.
But
Not
I
enough.
reached out to.
Not
I don't know
enough.
if his name is pronounced Omer. I will find out.
Not enough
Let's call
minerals.
him Omer. That's how it's spelled. I reached out to him on Twitter, and he agreed to come on the podcast. So
I can't build here.
anticipate that being a difficult conversation. And my interest is, as I've said before, in trying
Not
to figure
enough
out
minerals.
how to have hard conversations, how to start very far apart in a conversation,
Additional supply depots.
figure out how to converge, or at the very least, agree to disagree on specific points in a way that is not
Not enough.
entangled with personal hostility and misunderstanding. And that, admittedly,
enough
is
minerals.
a challenge that not everyone is up to. And so it's...
Not enough
you know, I
minerals.
tried it with Noam
Not
Chomsky,
enough minerals.
and I'll be trying it with other people. My conversation with Majid was also an example of that, and I didn't know how it was going to turn out, and it became hugely productive. So I'm going to be running similar psychological conversational experiments on my podcast. And oh man, taken some very hard shots at me in the past. I've returned fire. We're going to see if we can have a civil conversation. That'll be coming sometime in February. And also, I'll have Steve Pinker on at some point.
I'm on it. Sure thing.
I feel the need to apologize once again for the level of congestion we're on right now. Patient zero into the world. I don't know if they're out there playing with ducks in a pond or where they're getting these viruses, but they're bringing them to Daddy. So I bring them to you in a substandard audio performance. So bear with me there. So many of you noticed various Twitter controversies and wanted me to address them. Here's the first, with Fareed Zakaria, the CNN and Washington Post journalist. He sent out a tweet about a week ago endorsing a truly terrible piece of Islamist propaganda. And so the tweet read, "My book of the week, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think." That's the title of the book. And then he calls it An Essential Voice of Reason. Now, this book was written by John Esposito and Dalia Mogahed. And apologies again, I don't know exactly how to pronounce Dalia's last name. I will say Mogahed. It's probably not right. Esposito runs a Middle East Studies Center at Georgetown, and Mogahed works for Gallup, the famous polling organization that published this book that Zakaria was recommending. So I tweeted in response, "Witness the capture of academia, Esposito, polling, Gallup, and journalism, Zakaria, by rank Islamism." Now, many people took this tweet to be a sign that I had gone off the deep end by alleging some kind of stealth Islamist takeover of our institutions. Well, there is an attempted Islamist takeover of our institutions, and it's not especially stealthy. But to be clear, I wasn't claiming that Zakaria is an Islamist. Rather, I think he's probably been deceived by Islamist misinformation, of which there's an endless supply. And there is no question he's spreading such misinformation by pushing this book. And nor do I think Esposito is an Islamist, because to my knowledge he's not even a Muslim. But everything I've seen him publish about Islam has been, if not a lie, a half-truth. He's someone who I've called a Muslim apologist in the past. His center at Georgetown is funded with tens of millions of dollars by the Saudi government. It's the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim
Not
Christian
enough
Understanding.
minerals.
And its function appears to be to whitewash Islam in general and the obscenity of Saudi Wahhabi Islam in particular. Now, I was frankly unfamiliar with Mogahed. She's the executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies. I just happened to have seen her on Meet the Press a few days before, sitting beside my friend Azra Nomani, the eminently rational journalist and Muslim reformer. And more or less every word out of Mogahed's mouth was, again, a lie or a half-truth that seemed calculated to deceive a secular audience. She was saying things like the members of ISIS aren't
Not
religious,
enough
and
minerals.
that they have no theological or popular support, and there's no correlation between being a religious Muslim and being a jihadist. In fact, the correlation is negative, according to Mogahed. You're more likely to be a jihadist if you're not a devout Muslim. These statements are
Additional
completely
supply
dishonest.
depots required.
I did a little digging on Mogahed, and from what I can tell, it seems that she has some affinity for, if not direct connection to, the Muslim Brotherhood, as do many people who
Not
claim
enough
to be Muslim
minerals.
moderates in our
Not
society.
enough minerals.
And it's very annoying that only people on the political right, and many of whom are dogmatic Christians or Jews, seem to have the time or the temperament to point this out. A group like the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, which seems to be the most influential Muslim civil rights organization, was a direct offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood and has been supportive of terrorist organizations like Hamas. Is it connected with these organizations now? I don't know. Do its members even know? It could be like Scientology, where you don't know how crazy the organization is until you're deep in it. But I can tell you one thing for certain. This is an organization that systematically lies about Islam and demonizes its critics, and tries to make life as difficult as possible for people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And again, this group is treated like the Muslim ACLU by the press. It's insane. Both Esposito and Mogahed are darlings of this organization, as is Glenn Greenwald, as you know. So whatever her connections, Mogahed practices some of the worst forms of Islamist
Upgrade
obscurantism
complete.
and identity politics. She describes jihadism as a purely political phenomenon that has no connection to religious doctrine or belief. And needless to say, it's always arising out of that vast reservoir of, quote, legitimate grievances that Muslims have against the West. And she's also an Obama appointee. She sits on the President's Advisory Council on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships. And she's one of the people who had a hand in writing President Obama's famous Cairo speech. Again, I'm painfully aware
Additional supply
that
depots.
despairing over facts like these makes one sound like a right-wing crackpot. So, to be clear, I am an Obama supporter. I voted for him both times. I will almost certainly vote for Hillary Clinton in the fall, because I don't see any other conceivable choice, though I have to hold my nose over her obscurantism on this issue in particular. But it isn't crazy to worry that Islamists are gaming our system, because they quite obviously are. Now,
Not
again,
enough
I don't know for
minerals.
sure whether Mogahed is an Islamist. She wears the hijab and says some very dishonest things about Islam in general and Sharia law in particular. Still, she may just be a useful idiot like her colleague John Esposito. So the line here can be difficult to find. And it may not even be important to find it. It's the ideas and their influence, rather than the people conveying the ideas, that I'm worried about. This is also not to say that ideologically
Not
motivated
enough
people,
minerals.
even Islamists, couldn't produce an honest poll or a book based on such a poll.
Not enough minerals.
And I
Upgrade
certainly wasn't
complete.
discounting the
Add-on
contents of the book,
Complete.
because its authors strike me as nefarious and dishonest people. For instance, let's just flip this around. If I were to produce a poll
Not
of
enough
religious
minerals.
public opinion,
Not enough.
perhaps
Not
hiring an
enough
organization
minerals.
like Gallup or Pew to run it,
Not enough
here are two things about which I am certain. I'm certain I could do this honestly and make every effort to produce a poll that was well designed and scientifically valid. And I'm also certain that religious people and their apologists
Not
would
enough
reject
minerals.
its findings, whatever they happen to be, because of my history as a
Not
critic
enough
of religion.
energy.
I have
Not
made
enough
no secret
minerals.
of my views on religious
Not
faith. I
enough
think
minerals.
faith-based religion is dangerous and divisive bullshit. And I think Islam is the worst of the lot. So it would be totally understandable and also wrong for a religious person to reject a Gallup poll of religious opinion that I was associated with. So to be clear, I am not doing that in reverse. Okay, when Esposito and Mogahed's book came out in 2007, I bought it and I
Not
read it.
enough energy.
And I found it so obviously misleading as to not even be worth discussing. But now Fareed Zakaria is pushing it 8 years later as his pick of the week and as a, quote, essential voice of reason. And it should be disturbing that Zakaria can't see the flaws in this book, because again, they are so obvious.
Not enough.
So what's wrong with the book? Well, first, it purports to be an unprecedented and thoroughly scientific poll of Muslim public opinion.
Not enough.
But the authors don't show any data. And the ways they discuss their data, along with the kinds of questions they thought to ask in their poll, and the questions they declined to ask, prove that they were after a certain result, which was to make Muslim opinion look totally benign. They want you to believe that Islam is just like any other religion, and that Muslims worldwide are just like any other group of religious people. Now, the book isn't entirely filled with lies. Okay, the authors admit, for instance, that the imagined link between poverty and lack of education and terrorism, or support for terrorism, is a myth. Okay, they admit that the most radicalized people in the Muslim world tend to be middle class and educated. In fact, according to Esposito and Mogahed, the politically radicalized tend to be more satisfied with their financial situations and believe their standard of living is improving and are more optimistic about their futures in general than the so-called moderates are, which proves that the remedies that many secular liberals imagine exist for extremism in the Muslim world, that is, more education and economic opportunity, are not remedies at all. As I've been saying for years, I don't know how many more engineers have to fly planes into buildings or devote their lives to waging jihad in other ways for us to get it through our heads that the lack of education and economic opportunity isn't the cause of Muslim extremism. But even in making this concession, Esposito and Mogahed reveal that getting Islam off the hook is their goal. Their point is to say that the backgrounds of terrorists are so diverse as to fully exonerate religion. There's the usual tendentious nonsense about how the 9/11 hijackers went to strip clubs, for instance, which according to Esposito and Mogahed proves that they weren't really religious. Majid and I dealt with this lie in our book. They also point out that most jihadists aren't graduates from madrasas. This is the point that Scott Terran makes, as though this suggests a lack of connection between sincere religious belief in Islamic doctrine and jihadism. They even go so far as to intimate that the academic backgrounds of prominent jihadists suggest that almost anything could make one a jihadist. So Bin Laden, for instance, was, quote, trained in management, economics, and engineering. It's like who knows which of these streams of information could have radicalized him. Okay? This is pure obscurantism. But this isn't the worst part of the book. Okay? The worst part comes down to the questions that were asked, as well as those that weren't asked, and the way the results are discussed. So one of the most egregious examples can be found in the question that Esposito and Mogahed used to differentiate what they call radicals from, quote, moderates. They report that only 7% of Muslims worldwide consider the 9/11 attacks to be, quote, completely justified. And then they go on to say, therefore, that 9 in 10, 93%, quote, believe the attacks were not justified, and they call these people moderates. Incidentally, the press ran with this, reporting that 93% of Muslims, or 9 in 10, the world over, are, quote, moderate. Well, if you know anything about anything, you should be feeling a little queasy at this point. I took one look at this line, that only 7% of Muslims consider the 9/11 attacks to be, quote, completely justified. So 9 in 10 are moderates. And I knew I was being lied to by sinister people, or being misled by useful idiots. Again, I can't claim to know which of these categories Esposito and Mogahed fall into. Okay, so the first thing to point out is that even if true, even if this most sanguine of interpretations of this pseudo-data is true, 7% of Muslims believing that the atrocities of 9/11 were completely justified is a problem that should not be minimized. Okay, the authors equate this with 91 million people. Okay, their book came out in 2007. Today it's more like 112 million people. Recall what we're talking about here. We're talking about the intentional murder of 3,000 innocent non-combatants at a time that preceded our involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're talking about 112 million people who think that burning thousands of people alive in the Twin Towers was completely justified.
Not enough minerals.
That's already a huge reservoir of murderous lunacy. Okay, but of course, the real problem is that the 7% figure is totally misleading, and intentionally so. We can tell from the wording, quote, completely justified, that Gallup used a scale in its poll from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7,
Not enough
where completely
minerals.
justified and completely unjustified were at the tail ends. There was almost certainly
Not
a
enough
choice of
minerals.
somewhat justified or mostly justified or both that many people picked. And there was certainly a choice of don't know or no opinion. Think of all those people who couldn't say that the attacks of 9/11 were completely unjustified,
Additional
but
supply
said rather
depots
they were
required.
mostly justified or somewhat justified, or said they didn't know. Okay? These people are being
Not enough
described as
minerals.
moderates. And there's another problem with using this particular question as the dividing line between moderates and extremists. As many of you know, and as Esposito and Mogahed surely know, vast numbers of Muslims think that Muslims had nothing to do with the attacks of 9/11 because there were 4,000 Jews who didn't show up to work that day. Millions of Muslims believe that the Mossad and the CIA conspired to bring down the World Trade Center as a pretext to invade Muslim lands. In fact, one poll indicated that 16% of Americans believe something like this. It is the whole 9/11 truth movement. Right? So using this question in this way rigged the game. Okay? And again, Esposito and Mogahed almost certainly know this. And they know that if they had asked questions about apostasy or blasphemy or the rights of women and homosexuals and polytheists, or whether infidels deserve to spend eternity in hellfire, the results of their polling would have been appalling. Okay? And every poll of Muslim public opinion that has been run on these questions produces appalling results.
Upgrade
And again,
complete.
it literally took me 5 seconds to see the problem here. Why didn't Fareed Zakaria see it? He is a journalist who covers these issues. He doesn't want to see it. Even this fictional 7% is talked about in the book in a way that is obviously tendentious and misleading. They say, for instance, that, quote, if the 7%,
Additional
91
supply
million is
depots
politically
required.
radicalized, continue to feel politically dominated, occupied, and disrespected, the West will have little, if any, chance of changing their minds, end quote. Again, the burden is
Not
upon the
enough
West to
minerals.
behave better and show respect to people who think the attacks of September 11th were, quote, completely justified. And again, remember, these attacks came before we invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. Justified for what? Ask yourself that. I should say I invited Dahlia Mogahed on the podcast after a little sniping on Twitter, and she declined, but I would have been happy to speak with her. I've seen her
Not
promulgate
enough
what I now
minerals.
call the narrative, and basically everyone is doing this now, from President Obama on down. And it's understandable in some ways, but it's also scary. So pay attention. The idea I'm about to describe is almost unrivaled in its strangeness.
Insufficient Bespin
And yet
gas.
those hearing it for the first time, to say nothing of those who espouse it, never seem to notice
Insufficient
that something
Bespin
out of the
gas.
ordinary is being said.
Insufficient Bespin
Now, you've
gas.
heard this idea before, and I will venture to guess that you did not notice how strange and indeed terrifying
Upgrade
a
complete.
claim was being made. The idea is this. In fighting ISIS, or in resisting the spread of Islamic theocracy generally,
Not enough minerals.
we must at all
Not enough
costs
minerals.
avoid, quote, confirming the narrative of Islamic extremists. The fear is that any focus
enough
on the religion of
minerals.
Islam or its adherents, profiling at TSA, intelligence gathering at mosques, or merely acknowledging that we are at war not with generic terrorism, but with Islamic terrorism, will drive many more Muslims to
Not enough
support the
minerals.
jihadists. Now, think about what is actually being alleged here. Think about the
Not enough
underlying
minerals.
pessimism, if not paranoia, of this claim.
This better be
Let's
good.
use an analogy. Let's say you're a bald white man, and unluckily for you, there happens to be a global insurgency of neo-Nazi skinheads terrorizing 100 countries. Okay, most white men are perfectly peaceful, of course. But this insurgency has grown so captivating to a minority of them that no city on earth is truly safe. Bald white men have blown up planes and buses and burned embassies and even murdered innocent children by the hundreds. And we have spent trillions of dollars trying to contain the damage. Many of these bald white men are seeking to acquire nuclear materials, so that they can detonate dirty bombs or even atomic bombs in the capitals of Europe and the United States. And to make matters worse, many of these men are avowedly suicidal and therefore cannot be deterred. Now imagine hearing presidents and prime ministers and newspaper columnists and even your fellow bald white men express the fear that merely acknowledging the whiteness and baldness of neo-Nazi skinheads would so oppress and alienate other bald white men that they too would begin murdering innocent people. Imagine being told that at all costs we must not confirm the narrative of the neo-Nazis by acknowledging that white bald men emblazoned with swastikas are of greater interest from a security point of view than elderly Hawaiian women. Okay. This is the situation we're in. You might be somewhat confused by the racial characteristics of this analogy. Obviously, Islam is not a race. But most people appear to believe that by honestly describing the link between the doctrine of Islam and jihadism, and therefore admitting that Islam is of special concern in a way that Anglicanism and Mormonism aren't, that we will provoke otherwise peaceful Muslims to such a degree that they will become jihadists or support them. Now, this is either one of the most pessimistic and uncharitable things ever said about a community, or it's true. And if it's the former, we should stop saying it. And if it's the latter, we should be talking about nothing else and obliging Muslims to talk about nothing else. Where are these Muslims who are just like you in valuing freedom of speech and secular tolerance and scientific rationality, who want their daughters to grow up to be fully self-actualized members of society, who aren't afraid of cartoons, who think gays should be free to marry, but who, if subjected to an extra glance at the airport or a visit from the FBI at their mosque, will be, quote, radicalized and helplessly driven to support ISIS. They're just like you and me now, but say the wrong thing about Islam on television, and they'll start supporting a group that decapitates journalists and aid workers, rapes women by the tens of thousands, and throws gays from rooftops. That is what is being claimed, and it is absolutely shocking. Doubly so because no one is admitting or seeming to even notice what a shocking claim it is. And again, I don't know what is true here. It could be a totally reasonable fear, or it could be pure paranoia. But I'm pretty sure the difference matters. So that's all I have to say about that particular book and Contretemps on Twitter. Again, it is highly inconvenient that worrying about the spread of Islamist ideology and the deception that covers its spread immediately puts people in mind of the Red Scare and Joseph McCarthy and right-wing conspiracy theories. You have to follow the plot here. I am always talking about the necessity that freedom of speech and freedom of thought be safeguarded. You should be free to think and say whatever you want to say. And the people who are trying to write blasphemy laws, whether actually or effectively, in the way they're stigmatizing the criticism of Islam as tantamount to bigotry and xenophobia and even racism, these people are undermining the freedom of speech and the freedom of thought. There is no analogy to the Red Scare here, but it is, I just confess, highly inconvenient that the New York Times doesn't do a proper analysis of where the sympathies of people like Mogahed and Esposito are. And they don't talk about the corrupting influence of Saudi money, money from a regime that is theologically indistinguishable from ISIS, flooding our academic institutions and funding mosques worldwide and supplying them with literature that demonizes infidels and polytheists and, needless to say, Jews. So this is not conspiracy theory time. This is just the nefarious work of Islamists that is in plain view for anyone who wants to see it. But unfortunately,
it is exactly
most
Sam
of the
Harris.
people
It's
who
his
want
Waking
to see
Up podcast.
are on the right wing. So you do a Google search
You're
on
good, you.
someone like Dahlia Mogahed, and you're immediately dumped onto Front Page Magazine and the Weekly Standard and other conservative publications. That's because the liberal publications are not doing their job. and many of them are doing the other job,
Not enough.
obscurantism. And you have a place like Ceylon that gets this wrong almost as a matter of principle. Okay, so on to more of your actual questions. What progress have you made toward becoming vegetarian or vegan? So this question arises from my podcast. I think it was the second podcast I did with Paul Bloom, where we sort of stumbled into a intervention I performed on both of us around the topic of the ethics of eating meat. One of us asked the other, what would be on your short list for things that will just mortify our descendants on our behalf? You know, the way we look back on Thomas Jefferson, and we're just aghast that he couldn't see the wrongness of slavery. He was a supremely ethical and intelligent person who still couldn't see what an abomination slavery was. So what analogous blind spots do we have? And what will our descendants be scandalized by when we look back on this? And you know, on both of our short lists was the horror show of factory farming. And neither of us could defend it. Both of us participated in this machinery of death, and we both admitted that it's only because it's out of sight and out of mind that we were able to do so. And neither of us could defend eating meat under these circumstances, and nor could we defend delegating the acquisition of meat to others in this way. So we did kind of stumble into an intervention of sorts. Then I threw Paul under the bus by saying, well, I'm willing to make a change in my diet. And I don't know what kind of moral monster you are that you aren't, but in any case, that was a fun conversation. And at that point, I asked vegetarian and vegan listeners to send me resources and help me idiot-proof the process of getting off of meat. And I made that appeal because I had been a vegetarian for 6 years at one point and became anemic and just decided it was not a healthy diet for me. So yes, I have a little to report, but not enough that I want to go into it in any depth. But I can say that since that conversation, I have been a vegetarian, and now I think that's about 4 months ago. And I did some blood work recently, and strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, my lipid profile, my cholesterol and triglycerides, have gotten worse on a vegetarian diet, and I think that's largely because not because I'm eating more dairy and eggs, and yes, I'm aware of the ethical concerns around dairy and eggs, but because I'm probably eating more carbohydrates, and so it's the bread and the pasta and the rice and all the rest that's tweaking my blood sugar, and that has a unhappy effect on lipids. I'm still working with this. I'm still a vegetarian. I am an aspiring vegan. I'll keep trying to find my way through this science experiment without making food preparation and eating a new religion for myself or the center of my life. I have to be realistic about what I can do here. I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. So, at the very least, I'm convinced about the ethical problem of eating meat. The eggs I buy claim to be impeccable ethically. Every chicken has something like 108 square feet of pasture to run on. And I am aware that that doesn't answer the concern of what happens to the male chicks born in their hatcheries. But I'm still not convinced that I can be a healthy vegan at this point. But I'm going to try to be convinced. So, again, this is a slow unwinding of my carnivore lifestyle. But in any case, I've made the big change, which is I no longer eat meat, chicken, or fish. I suppose you could even make the case that eating fish, given our current system, is more ethical than continuing to eat dairy and eggs. I would be interested to know how you vegans and vegetarians view that. I did have one idea for a short book or a long blog article where I could go through the comparative neuroanatomy of various species, as well as what we know about the likely basis of consciousness and pain and suffering in various animal brains, and try to make some intelligent ranking of the likely harm done at each stage. So is it worse to kill a cow than a fish? Is it worse to kill a pig than a cow? Can you really eat oysters and other bivalves without any
Research
concern
complete.
that they may be suffering.
Not
This might be
enough
interesting to
minerals.
look at some point. Take a fair amount of time to do it right, but in any case, that's at the back of my mind to look at. Next question. This one's from Faisal Saeed al-Muhtar, who many of you know is the ex-Muslim Iraqi reformer and voice of reason. He's recently on Dave Rubin's show, and he had a great interview there. He was one of the people I consulted on my book with Majid, and he gave some very helpful notes. He's great. Anyway, he asks, if the Islamic Reformation / modernization movement doesn't succeed, what do you think should be the alternative? And that's an extraordinarily difficult question. I think I can't answer. I don't think there is an alternative. If Islamic reform / modernization doesn't succeed, we will have a continuous source of conflict with free speech, tolerance of diversity, gender equality, and respect for science. I think it will work at some point because it will become so painful and untenable that it will just have to work. I don't know how much blood will be spilled or how many pendulum swings toward reactionary governments we'll see in Europe and even in the United States. I don't know how many Donald Trump campaigns we'll have to endure. Again, I'm not especially worried that there's going to be a Trump presidency, but it's conceivable, and it's conceivable because of this, but it has to succeed.
Complete.
Or at the very least, Islam has to become like
Base
Christianity
is
in
under
the
attack.
United States.
Not enough
That's a
minerals.
problem that's big enough for me to have written a short book about it, Letter to a Christian Nation, but it's comparatively tolerable. Once we get there, once the Middle East is like the Bible Belt, then we'll have the luxury of trying to fine-tune it and wondering what the far future might look like. Okay, another question. This is a longish
Additional
question
supply
that got
depots
by email,
required.
and it contains a criticism, but I thought it was good, so I'll read the whole thing.
Additional
Here's my
supply
question with some
depots
context
required.
set up. Do you think your reliance on hypotheticals and thought experiments has become a hindrance to making headway in discourse on important issues, in particular the threat of
Additional
Islamic terrorism? Generally
research.
speaking, how big a role should thought experiments and hypotheticals play in discussing key issues? It seems that lately you've given several gifts to your detractors, namely the statement about Ben Carson. While I understand your position in stating that you support him over Chomsky in terms of terrorism only, I still think this was a disastrous tactical error that didn't need to be made. Your point could have been made in any number of ways that didn't involve taking an absurd position, voting for Carson under any metric, on a situation that will never actually happen. Chomsky running for president. Imagine a person that had not heard of your work until seeing that statement. Do you think they'd be more or less likely to dig deeper and fully explore the nuance of your views, or write you off as a tactic? If the goal is to win the war of ideas, it seems like tactics like this might be doing you more harm than good. The non-starter with Chomsky and the defense of torture in certain circumstances are other areas where relying on thought experiments and hypotheticals did not seem to win many supporters. The name is Jason Teifel. Thank you, Jason. Well, I agree. I think it's probably, in the specific instances you cite, counterproductive. And perhaps I should be more disciplined in how I screen for those statements which wind up being counterproductive or easily used to mislead people about my views. The Ben Carson thing is very obvious, though I couched it with so many caveats and so much context that one really had to be totally malicious to spread the meme that I support Ben Carson for president. But of course, I have critics who are just that malicious. Someone like Max Blumenthal did just that. The issue is when people are that malicious in their use of ellipses, they can defame you with any statement. But I take your point. They may not notice that you were talking about anything until you make a statement of the sort I made about Carson. And the net result of that one certainly was not helpful. On the question of thought experiments, I notice now I offered one at the top and talking about the narrative. They do serve the purpose, if the analogy one is drawing is correct, of clarifying people's thinking and getting down to first principles. Using a thought experiment or an analogy, however surprising, can break the spell for people in a way that just talking more and more about the complex details of events in the world. I can't. So, yeah, I would be reluctant to say that thought experiments and hypotheticals shouldn't be used, but I think more care is needed in resorting to them, perhaps, or at least justifying their use. And, I didn't think that kind of care was needed in the case of talking with someone like Chomsky, because obviously he's a celebrated academic who understands what is going on when someone resorts to a hypothetical. He's also someone who seems inclined to deliberately miss the point to serve his side of the argument. I have to factor in the price I pay for being so on my guard in conversations like the one I was having with Douglas Murray that I wind up just not having useful conversations, not branching out into areas that are ethically interesting and consequential, where my views may prompt someone to think differently in important ways than they thought before. I find it thrilling when someone raises a point that I find I'm uncomfortable with, and I'm being led helplessly in the direction of something that I find destabilizing to my cherished opinions. And I can't see any errors that are being made, and yet I don't like where I'm being taken. I find that absolutely thrilling. I find those moments some of the best moments in intellectual life. And I've been told by many of you that I managed to do that for you. So I would be reluctant to stop doing that. I would be reluctant to speak more like a politician than I do. But I would be the first to admit that I may have caused myself more headaches than I should have by not being more careful than I've been. So I don't do a lot of censoring of what I think or how I say things, but increasingly I find that I do some because, again,
I'm terrible at
if I didn't
Legacy of the
care
Void, and I don't
whether
even
I was
like it.
misrepresented, it would be a lot easier. And getting off of Twitter would be one way not to care, because I seem to only see these things on Twitter. But as I said as well, I also see some useful things on Twitter, and some of the upcoming conversations I will have on this podcast are a result of what I've seen there. So there may be no perfect solution. I'll just keep trying to find my way as I eat nothing but vegetables. Next question. This is a similar one, actually. Obviously, it's your, quote, controversial views that gain the most notoriety. However, the importance of an idea and how much attention it receives are only loosely related. Some ideas, arguably such as your stance on profiling, may turn out to be relatively unimportant, regardless of how reasonable or well-reasoned it is. Worse, it could be actively unhelpful. Such topics can be so explosive, and your position may not condense to tweet length, that it can easily be used by opponents to denigrate you. In this regard, sharing such ideas could detract from more critical thinking. In what ways should the imagined repercussions affect what you
I
decide
love
to publicly
those,
share?
especially when
If you
there's
believe something
Zergs.
to be true, would it be moral to withhold it? In this respect, is there such a thing as a noble lie of omission? Are there ideas you've decided against sharing? What are they? That's interesting. Share them now. And are there views of yours that you believe don't get enough attention? And this is from Jordan. Thank you, Jordan. Again, yeah, I think and I once wrote an article, I believe it was entitled "Why I'd Rather Not Speak About Torture" on my blog, and I said there, or somewhere, that I once had an epiphany that not everything worth saying is worth saying oneself. And that is still true. I still think that's true, and I notice certain people abide by this precept much better than I do, and have commensurately easy lives as a result. I would put someone like Steve Pinker in this category. This is not true of somebody like Richard Dawkins, who gets down in the trenches in the same way that I do. Part of this is the ideas themselves, right? So that there are topics like profiling, for instance, where I just think it's ethically both interesting and important to figure out what we think on this topic. Get this wrong in any significant way, and people will die. People by what? The hundreds, the thousands? It's truly important that we figure this out. So, yeah, I'm reluctant to say that I shouldn't touch those topics. But in hindsight, I can say that, yeah, some of them have been just more trouble than they're worth. And as I think I've said on this podcast at least once, that, I tore up the best book contract I've ever had simply because I thought the topic was going to be more trouble than it's worth. The working title of the book was Letters to a Young Liberal, and I was going to go after political correctness in all its forms and talk about not only things like Islamophobia, but talk about violence in general, and wealth and power and gender, and essentially create a multi-front war for myself on every topic that the regressive left, as we now call them, following Majid, has stifled conversation. And I pitched that book and sold it, and was then tasked to write it, and literally 2 days in to that contract, I decided this was a terrible mistake, and in the interest of sanity, I tore up the contract. And I'll tell you what convinced me of this, and you can be the judge of whether this makes sense. But so the first thing that happened, this was back when Ferguson was kicking off, and I realized that had I written this book already, and it did touch issues of policing and identity politics around race and all of the other really difficult and consequential material in that area. If I had written this book and it had just come out, I then, in the act of promoting it, would have had to have been the white guy on CNN talking to Cornel West about police procedure and police brutality. Did I want to be that
Additional
person?
supply depots required.
I decided, no, I didn't. I don't want to be... I would have been thrown into contexts where it would be impossible to make sense on, again, these very important issues without being demonized by, in the same way that I have been demonized by the left, but now by just a factor of 10. And the other thing that convinced me, which was also just a surprise, but Sarah Silverman, who I don't know, but who I greatly admire, which is fantastic, noticed my blog post on the Gaza conflict, entitled "Why Don't I Criticize Israel?" ? She noticed this article and liked it clearly and retweeted it to her 5 million fans, saying something like, please read this with an open mind. And this was like 3 months or more after I had written that article. And my first reaction was not to be happy that someone I greatly admire liked what I had written and sent it out to her huge audience. No, my immediate reaction was, why did she have to do that? Like, what a fucking headache for me and for her, right? And I knew that she was going to start getting my hate mail, which I didn't want her to have to get, and I was just happy to not have to talk about Gaza and Israel again, because it was just so painful. And again, it's made painful by just the sheer idiocy that comes your way. It's not made painful by the serious criticisms and counterpoints, which are there to be made. It's not made painful by honest conversation on the topic. It's made painful by the demagoguery of people like Glenn Greenwald and all the rest.
Our SCVs
And it's, so my reaction to that, I look at her Twitter feed and she immediately gets, I used to think you were funny, but now I see you're just a Zionist kike. Just all of it, right? How much more of that do I want in my life when I could be having conversations of the sort that I just had with David Deutsch? And so, so I tore up that book contract and totally happy that I did, though I think that book should exist in some form. The other factor here is that I have a problem with bullies, and when I see someone being a bully, whether it's toward me or toward someone else, I find it difficult not to respond. Many of you saw a recent collision between me and Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan and Antifragile and other books, which I actually wasn't going to talk about, but Taleb is someone I've gone after before because he's attacked me as a charlatan, all in capital letters. And I just noticed him attacking Steve Pinker, again, as a charlatan, all in capital letters, and as a journo, which he means, by which he means journalist. So I wasn't aware that he'd been going after Pinker, but when I saw him do that, I had to push back. And I should say, when I pushed back, some of you noticed, some of you worried that I was pushing back against him unfairly and being a little mean-spirited in the process. You should just know the history here and judge for yourself. Again, I wasn't going to talk about this, but people, this is how the sausage gets made. I know many of you love this guy, and think he's a genius. I can assure you, none among you are as impressed with his intelligence as he is. This guy is just insufferable, and he's a bully, and he's, most of the time, doesn't make any sense, and never knows it. I've actually never witnessed a marriage of incompetence and confidence so fully and grotesquely consummated in the mind of a person with a public platform. This is the most arrogant person I've ever had the misfortune of meeting. I had one lunch with him at a conference we both attended, and then he insinuated himself into a debate that I had been scheduled to have with an already vastly overcrowded debate at Ciudad de las Ideas in Mexico, the Mexican version of TED. And that debate can be viewed in its entirety on YouTube. This was a debate where we had it was me and Hitch and Dan Dennett on one side, and Dinesh D'Souza and Rabbi Botiak, and I've forgotten who else on the other side. But then Nassim Taleb insinuated himself into the debate. He was aghast that he had not been invited to participate, and though he had another talk scheduled at the conference, he really must be included in this debate because he had something so valuable to share. And he was included because he can't resist such an 800-pound gorilla. Now, I should say that I met him first, and when you meet him, you quickly discover that he radiates a sense of grievance from his pores in a way that few people do. It's kind of like a preternatural force of negative charisma. And he can convey his contempt for everyone at the table, just even in the way he says, pass the salt. He's so convinced that his genius has not been appropriately lauded that he finds some way to communicate this in almost every interaction. He's a child in a man's body. And the mismatch between his estimation of himself and the quality of his utterances is so complete and so mortifying to witness in person that you're just finding you're jumping out of your skin. And you can see what he brought to the stage by seeing that. It was a performance that I think will stand the test of time for its incoherence,
Someone beat me finally.
Censure of others on the stage, with which that incoherence was espoused. It's really an amazing performance. And so, whenever Taleb starts bullying someone, the first time this happened, he just attacked me out of the blue. I don't know what provoked it, but I just started seeing on Twitter that he was calling me a charlatan, and now he's doing the same for Steve Pinker. So whenever he's done this, I think he's done this twice that I've noticed, all I've done is share this video in its entirety. I'm not greenwalding him. Greenwalding, by the way, is a word now that's taking off on Twitter, which I love. You'll know what it means in context. I was not greenwalding him. I was not taking some partial and misleading snippet of his speech and defaming him that way. No, I'm spreading the entire content, his entire, whatever it is, it's in 3 segments. I spread the whole thing on Twitter and say, yes, please recognize what a genius we're dealing with. Right? Judge for yourself whether this guy makes any sense at all, whether his animus towards science is compelling. And the first time I did this, he went berserk and he said, it just shows you what a coward you are, that you will deal with YouTube videos, but you won't deal with my published work, which of course is brilliant. And then he hurled some paper at me, which I read, also found terrible, and tweeted to my audience in, I thought, an entirely fair way. I said, Nassim Taleb thinks it's very important that you all read this paper. And I spread it that way. So I spread the content, which is in fact representative of what the guy is up to on these topics. In any case, he went berserk on Twitter. He may still be going berserk as I speak these words. And he called me a pseudoscientist and demanded to know what scientific papers I published. And his discussion of these topics is so unprofessional that, again, I wouldn't engage with it, but for the fact that he is this tremendous bully. He's a very rich and, in some circles, well-regarded person. I'm not punching down when I deal with this guy. inexplicably, there are people like Daniel Kahneman, who really is an 800-pound gorilla, will share the stage with him. And you can see him occasionally bail him out when he begins to become incoherent. But for the life of me, I can't see why anyone takes him seriously beyond the few memorable ideas he's had, like the notion of a black swan, which may in fact be the black swan of Taleb's career, which is to say the one instance in which he made sense. In his attack on me, Taleb brought up a few things which, again, in a totally incoherent way, which many of you may find interesting or relevant, and I think I've tried to sort this out in previous podcasts, but see if you can follow this. There's something here that's important and about which many people are confused. He claims I'm not a scientist, that I'm just a journalist, and he very snidely demanded to know whether I had ever published any neuroscientific papers. By what measure am I a neuroscientist? And then, so I sent him the 2 fMRI papers I had published, and he got back with, what, you've only published 2 scientific papers with 6 different co-authors? How does that make you a neuroscientist? So there's an instance of a goalpost moving there. He asked to see the papers, which he assumed didn't exist. I sent him 2 papers, and he rejected them as being only 2 and having co-authors. He doesn't seem to understand anything about the conventions of publishing within science in general and neuroscience in particular. But then I responded, well, surely you, of all people in the team, are not claiming that scientific thought can only be confined to academic journals. And then he got back saying that most of his best papers had not been published, but they were rigorous. So now he's saying that it doesn't really matter if you publish in academic journals. But for some reason, his papers are more rigorous. His unpublished papers are more rigorous than mine. And this thing is made even more incoherent because he's attacking Steve Pinker in precisely the same terms. Again, charlatan in all capital letters, journo, as a journalist. And Steve has, I don't know, 150, 200 academic papers. It doesn't make any sense. And then he, I think, tried to accuse me of hypocrisy for attacking Reza Aslan for lying about his academic credentials, as though I was a stickler for academic credentials. So let me try to clear up confusion on this point, because there really is a real possibility of confusion here, and I think it's important to sort out. I don't care about credentials. I care about people's arguments and their evidence. I certainly don't care about whether something is published in an academic journal or in a book or on a blog. Again, I care about ideas. And I live my own life from that point of view. Now, my PhD is in neuroscience. I have always considered myself a philosopher first. Now, that's going to gall many academic philosophers who do care about credentials and think that my lack of a PhD in philosophy disqualifies me to consider myself a philosopher. Well, sorry.
I don't know what I'm doing in this game, but it's not good.
Philosophy. It's moral philosophy, it's meta-ethics, it's the philosophy of mind, and these are the kinds of questions that interest me. And I got a PhD in neuroscience because I want to be able to do that from the most scientifically informed place. And I'm still doing some research in neuroscience. I collaborated on a paper as a follow-up to my first 2 on belief, and that's in process now. And so I'm still doing neuroimaging work, but it is not what I'm doing mostly, and I don't have an appointment at a university. I'm mostly writing and doing podcasts like this. So I write books, I write blog posts, I write articles, I do podcasts, and I attempt to spread my ideas in a forum that's most effective for the spread of ideas. I'm often asked to submit papers to academic journals, and I always decline. Why do I decline? Because that is effectively burying my work. Right? Why would I write a paper for a philosophy journal when I can write an article on my blog that will be read by literally 1,000 times the number of readers? There are certain things that can only be published first in a proper academic journal, like an fMRI experiment should be published in some relevant journal. But generally speaking, It would be crazy for me to write for academic journals. There's no reason to do
Not
it.
enough
And,
minerals.
so
Not
the
enough
last conversation I
minerals.
had with
Not
David
enough
Deutsch,
minerals.
he and I could
Not
have
enough
approached
minerals.
some
Not enough minerals.
scientific or philosophical journal and
Not
decided to
enough
have a
minerals.
conversation about the foundations of science and the nature of explanation and the prospects of artificial
enough
intelligence
minerals.
posing a problem for humanity and the other topics we talked about. And I'm sure we could have gotten it published, and I'm sure a little more than 500 people would have ever seen it in that context. And it would have taken much more work
Add-on
to do,
complete.
right? Here we just got on Skype and more or less covered the same
Additional
ground,
supply depots
and
required.
all of you heard it, and most of you found it very interesting and useful, as I did, because David is an extremely deep thinker.
Not
But
enough
this
minerals.
podcast isn't peer-reviewed,
Not enough
right?
additional supply.
Feel free to review it yourself. It's peer-reviewed in terms of whether the
bad.
ideas survive their collision with the minds of listeners like yourself. So, I don't care about where people publish, and I certainly don't care about people's credentials. The only reason why I criticize Ray Dawson about his
Oh, that's
is
really
because
bad.
he's obviously exaggerating them. And
I'm
he's
starting to play
denigrating
people worth it,
everything
finally.
else.
Research.
There's no
so
one
if I
who
lose.
has been more attached to the
He did what
credentials
I
of his
did better.
opponents and more complimentary of his own than Ray Zossi. Every time he opens his mouth, he reminds you he's a PhD. Unfortunately, the subject he has that degree in keeps changing and never seems to accurately describe the one he actually holds. So I was criticizing Reza Aslan as a liar and a hypocrite because you know I have a problem. And this is one of my hobbies. Lying is the worst thing you can do, interpersonally, professionally. It's
Additional
just,
supply
it is
depots required.
kryptonite. I'm consoled by the fact that some of my worst enemies are rather avid liars. Right? These
Never gonna
lies
answer that.
eventually will bring them down. I am reasonably confident of that. So, I hope that clarifies my collision with Taleb. I guess the final point to make there is, as many of you know, the difference, the distinction between science and philosophy for the rest of our intellectual life is not hard and fast. And I think viewing it as hard and fast is a genuine intellectual error of some consequence. So, depending on the context, I call myself a neuroscientist, mostly because that is the title of the degree that I have.
Not
And
enough energy.
some of my interests can be narrowly defined as neuroscientific. Some of my writing, individual chapters in some of my books are pure neuroscience. But I don't think these distinctions matter, and happily I'm not in a position to be titling myself. And I don't meet many people like Nassim Taleb who care or pretend to care about what I call myself. And when I sit down with people like Jocko Willing next week and talk about violence, am I a neuroscientist? Probably not. Am I a philosopher? Maybe. Probably not. My intellectual interests aren't easily pigeonholed. But I certainly won't cop to being a journalist, because that is not how I operate. And if you notice how I conduct my interviews, I'm not merely asking questions of my guests. I'm trying to have a conversation.
Is under attack.
And very often I'm taking up as much space as they are. And that's on purpose. It's a conversation. It's not a normal interview, because I want to talk to you. And I presume that if you're listening to this podcast, you want to hear me talk. Apologies if all of this sounds weirdly defensive, but again, I just come out of war zone, social media.
They did a bit better than me.
Next
That's
question.
cool.
You place a lot of value on truth as an ideal, yet isn't lifting truth to such a lofty position sometimes itself irrational? Imagine a man who is happily married. Unbeknownst to him a
Now I'll
decade
be
ago,
playing
his
these
wife
guys
cheated.
forever.
She's not unfaithful now, nor is she ever likely to be unfaithful again. The man learning this information would result in his being traumatized
That was just
and
dumb.
destroy
I
the
should have
marriage,
beaten him.
leaving both of them miserable. The children would likewise be terribly affected by the resulting divorce. Is there any value gained by the man learning this truth, outside of truth as an ideal to strive for in and of itself? Wouldn't everyone involved be happier for this man's ignorance of this aspect of reality? Well, granted, there are some borderline conditions
That looks
where
like diamond.
it seems
I
plausible
wanna
to talk
win.
about truths that one is better off
Let's
not
try to
knowing.
do so.
But that's not the same question as whether or not one should lie to conceal these truths. For instance, I distinguish in my book Lying between keeping secrets
Not
and
enough
telling lies.
minerals.
And if you have to tell a lie to keep a secret, well then, generally speaking, I think the secret is not worth keeping. It intrinsically separates you from the people you care about. And the lie is usually told out of fear for what the consequences would be if those closest to you knew the truth about what you had done or what you thought. So, insofar as one wants to live a life of real intimacy
Not
and
enough minerals.
relative transparency, then I think keeping significant secrets and lying so as to safeguard them is not the way to do it. The more interesting question is, how could one become the sort of person who could know the truth, even truth of the sort described in that question, and be okay with it? I mean, is it really written somehow in the fabric of the universe or in the wiring plan of the human brain that it's impossible to overcome an infidelity, especially if it has no relevance in the present and reflected in some sense the actions of a different self years before? I don't think so. But again, there are people for whom this is setting the bar way too high. And if you know that about yourself, or you know that about someone close to you, well then, keeping a secret or lying or avoiding certain types of information can become a kind of matter of self-defense or a defense of another's sanity. And I'm not saying that those situations never exist, but generally speaking, I want to know what has happened in my life. I want to know whether those closest to me have been deceiving me. And the remedy for their past deceptions, it seems to me, is not continuing to deceive me on those specific points. So I would want that information. And I actually can't think of an example in my own life of wishing I hadn't known something. Are you guys constantly
Upgrade
experiencing
complete.
this? You find out something unpleasant
Not enough
about someone
minerals.
you know, and considering the situation in its totality, you wish you didn't know that thing. You wish you were in the dark about it. You find out someone is only pretending to like you, but behind your back they say terrible things about you. When you learn that, you wish you
Not
didn't
enough
know that
additional supply
about them.
depots
Is that
required.
your intuition? It's never been mine. So, in any case, I admit that it's possible, but it's just not the common case. And my default is to say the truth is almost always better than a lie, though there's certainly some scope
Our
for keeping secrets.
SCVs are under
I
attack.
discuss these cases more in my book Lying, if any of you are
Our
interested.
SCVs are under
And it just so
attack.
happens I received another question just now on a similar topic. Question from an ex-Muslim reader. Okay, I'm a 21-year-old ex-Muslim and have been in the closet since I was 15, when I first lost my faith. Recently I read a blurb by Rebecca Goldstein for a book called Creating Change Through Humanism by Roy Speckart. And if you don't know who Rebecca Goldstein is, she's a novelist, philosopher, and also happens to be the better half of Steve Pinker, and quite a wonderful woman, which so eloquently put down in words
Not enough
everything that's been
minerals.
troubling me. She writes about how debilitating it can be to lead a double life, and how the cognitive dissonance can eventually lead to a loss of one's sense of integrity. At the end, she asks the following question, which resonates deeply with many ex-Muslims, including
Upgrade
myself.
complete.
Is it possible to be a person of integrity while maintaining a radical
Not enough
bifurcation
minerals.
between one's outer and inner lives? And if that inner life
Not
should
enough
value
minerals.
rationality, free
Not
inquiry,
enough minerals.
and the right of all of us to flourish to our fullest, then how can you keep silent about the conclusions to which your rational free inquiry has brought you? End quote. And the questioner continues, I'll give you a short background. I live in a country where apostasy is punishable by death. Okay, just you listeners, just take a moment
Not
to
enough minerals.
imagine what that's like.
Not enough
Understand
mi-
it's a reality.
Not enough energy.
Of many people who are also listening to this podcast. It's a reality of many people who also have to listen to the crazy denials of the problem of Islamism from all the usual suspects. The writer continues, and I realize that coming out in such a circumstance is not an option at all. But I was born to loving parents, the cherry-picking, peace-loving kind, and will quite likely have an opportunity to move out of here after completing my education. My apostasy will have only social costs, so I am luckier than some Muslim women who often endure physical violence from their family. However, my relative good fortune has allowed me to speculate about the implications of coming out. I am painfully aware that most religions, especially Islam, are the complete antithesis of everything I value, and that it is necessary for ex-Muslims to stand together in critique of the insanely barbaric doctrines of Islam. This is a person born to a Muslim family, in a Muslim country, in the closet as an atheist, saying these things about
Not
Islam.
enough minerals. Add-on
Is this
complete.
person a bigot? Is this person an Islamophobe?
Not
Scrub
enough
the hard
minerals.
drive of your brain
Not enough.
with these kinds of
Not
confessions.
enough
If you
minerals.
feel any concern at all that
Not
critics
enough minerals.
of Islamic doctrine are lying about the nature of the doctrine. At the same time, I cannot help but wonder if doing this would be worth the personal costs of openly criticizing Islam, such as rejection and ostracism from my beloved family and friends. In the short flicker of consciousness that we are blessed with on this planet, could a person say she lived a good life if she was denied familial
Not
love
enough
throughout?
minerals.
Although it has its own challenges, in
Additional
some
supply
respects it's
depots
easier for
required.
ex-Muslims who face violence and hatred from their families to start a new life once they have migrated to another
not
country.
enough minerals.
But the majority of
Not
Muslims,
enough
such as
minerals.
myself, are stuck between two worlds. We do not want to leave everything behind, and we do not want our actions to hurt
Add-on
our family.
complete.
But living a life
Research
against our core
complete.
principles is mentally and spiritually taxing.
Additional supply
Would you be
depots
willing to be
required.
ostracized from the people you love for the sake
Additional
of the greater
supply
good?
depots
Should
required.
ex-Muslims, like us, delegate the task of critiquing religion to such people as Ali Rizvi and Sarah Hayter, who are able to leave the religion with fewer repercussions? Or do you believe that the threat of fundamentalist Islam is so great that people should risk ostracism, violence, and even death to
Not
fight
enough
against it?
minerals.
Is it even possible to fully flourish as a human being while living your whole life under a pretense?
Not
And she
enough
closes by saying, I
not
apologize
enough
if these
energy.
questions sound
Not
naive,
enough
not
minerals.
at all,
Not enough
considering how many
minerals.
more, quote, serious problems within Islam we need to tackle. Well, they're not at all naive, and, arguably they're among the most serious questions. This is the issue. How do you transform the
Insufficient
attitudes
vesting gas.
hundreds of millions of people who are not jihadists, obviously, but who acquiesce and tacitly support or maybe even actively
I
support
bet you that
social
causes
norms
one of them to get
stifle
like just
freedom
instantly
of
killed.
speech and free thought
And I could have done
creativity,
something about it.
everything
I could
else,
have repaired it.
your right to value. And I'm sorry, I just don't have an answer to that
See if
question
this
in
is really
the
gonna be able. Oh
specific
boy.
case of any individual. I have a
Yeah,
general
see, this
answer.
one would have
And the general
survived.
answer is, as you
Now it's
clearly
happening.
know, free speech has to be in. I think people have to come out of violence. Have to criticize bad ideas, and kids should talk back to their parents, and teachers should
Look at this
principally
guy.
educate their students to not believe what their parents
Insufficient
insist is
vesting
true,
gas.
if in fact it isn't.
Insufficient
But in the case of
vesting
any
gas.
one person, I can't say, yes, I think you should come out of the closet and your life would be better for it. Because my remarks about lying in self-defense could well apply here. If you think your life will be destroyed, violently or otherwise, by telling the truth, well then the reason to keep the truth hidden by whatever means necessary is obvious, and I think it's obviously justified. And only you can decide what the risks are and what the costs are, in your case, of not being honest with your parents. And in my experience, people from all denominations can find themselves in situations analogous to this one. There are Christians who are worried about losing everyone they love. There are husbands and wives who are married to a spouse with whom they have children, and they can't tell their spouse that they've lost it. And now they're deciding how intolerable that is, whether they can live bringing their children to believe this thing they no longer believe, just to avoid having to deal with their spouse's reaction once he or she likes it, they no longer believe in God. The same, of course, is true of children and their parents. But what is unique to the Muslim world, the Muslim world is not just in the Middle East, Muslim majority countries, but incredible concern about violence. Now, it sounds like this woman does not actually fear her family, which is great, although she fears losing them. She doesn't fear having them kill her. Again, I can't emphasize too often that that is the situation that so many Muslims are in. Muslim women and girls in particular, who are worried about being murdered by their own family members if they talk honestly about what they believe to be true about a holy God. It's almost impossible for many of us to understand that that is really going on, but it is. So I'm sorry, I want to thank you for writing. And again, you should know that there are many other people precisely in your situation. And I would encourage you to write to Sarah Hayder and Ali Rizvi, who have a far more informed opinion on this topic than I ever could. And maybe they should set up something analogous to the Clergy Project, an anonymous web forum of people who are ex-Muslims but are, for one reason or another, still in the closet. Maybe that exists. In any case, I find these kinds of emails heartbreaking, and they are in large measure why I keep talking about Islam. That and the intolerable affronts to free speech that we're all living with. It's interesting to think about what sort of response someone like Glenn Greenwald would or could give to an email like this. What's he going to say? Well, don't you realize it's the same thing happens with new atheist kids who are worried about being murdered by their parents or ostracized? New atheists are just as fundamentalist as any religious group. I'm going to lay that down in this context. So I feel for you, and I certainly encourage you to get out of that, whatever country that is. Apostasy is a killing offense. Come to the West. Surround yourself with sensible people, and you'll be in a different position to decide whether or not you want to tell your parents what you believe. Another question here from a woman who describes herself as a cognitive neuroscientist in Argentina. So the question is on the topic of the ever-present topic of politics now. She says, I'll simplify your arguments against the regressive left and summarize them as, quote, the left has missed the point so badly that they're basically responsible for smart and otherwise sensitive people like yourself who lean towards the right. And then she goes on to say, this argument has always troubled me. I saw it epitomized in the recent presidential elections in Argentina. Isn't it intellectually and politically lazy to support right-wing ideas and policies just because the left has gotten it or most of it wrong? I get that you are a two-party system, but there surely must be some room for nuance. Don't you think that people in positions like yours could also be advocating a better left?
Upgrade complete.
Well, yes. Thank you for the question. I think you misunderstood my point on this topic. I do view myself as someone who's advocating for a, quote, better left. I'm liberal in virtually every relevant sense. And,
Heading out.
So
Let's go.
I don't know what to call myself because so many, quote, liberals are confused about the problem of global jihadism. It's misleading to call myself a liberal in that context. My views on the topic are a result of increased sympathy with the political right. It's just I am worried about a time where, given a choice between the right and the left, when the left is this confused on this topic of really civilizational importance, and given a forced choice, and that even otherwise liberal people will be forced to choose the right. And, I see that potentially happening in Europe before the U.S., but I can see that happening in the U.S. as well. It's not a matter of becoming more right-wing. It's a matter of, the house is on fire, and the only people who seem aware that flames don't usually belong on the ceiling are members of the right. Okay, so then who are you going to trust to put out the fire? You've got at least one side is talking about fire more or less accurately and acknowledging that it shouldn't be where it currently is. The other side is speaking pure delusion, and in many cases reaching for a can of gasoline. That's the problem. If you have an emergency, only one side seems to be cognizant of it, well then that's the side you have to pick. And again, I don't think we're in that situation yet, but I could see us pushed there by a sufficiently large act of terrorism. And this goes back to the thing I said about Ben Carson. Again, Ben Carson is a religious idiot of the first order. And happily his campaign now is foundering and we'll never hear from him again. But yes, I do view someone like Noam Chomsky on this issue as being suicidally out to lunch. Right? His views about the total culpability of the West for the problem of jihadism, that is just a sinkhole, morally and politically, that we have to avoid. We have to do anything we can to avoid going down that hole into massacre, into this supine effort to placate our enemies, no matter how diabolical. And we now have some truly diabolical enemies. And if ISIS videos can't convince you of that, well, then you are unreachable. ISIS videos aren't our propaganda. Right? This isn't us producing caricatures of the enemy. This is what the enemy is producing as its own outreach. Watch some of those videos. Tell me that they're an expression of some sort of legitimate grievance against the West. Tell me that it's our job to create a safe space for these barbarians. Tell me that the term barbarian is excessive in this case. Go ahead and run that psychological experiment on yourself. Just don't do it before dinner. There's one question here about the Black Lives Matter campaign and the so-called Ferguson effect in policing, where the violent crime rate has gone up in several cities, possibly as a result of cops no longer policing as actively. I guess I'll defer that to my interview with Scotty Reitz. Again, he'll be the right person to go down that particular rabbit hole. One reader asks, how fast do you read? Actually, quite slowly. Occasionally I'll skim something, but basically I read everything like it's scripture. I don't speed read. I read far too slowly. Here's a question. I've heard many atheists talk about polygamy as a negative aspect of certain religions, and I agree wholly that it is an evil when forced on anybody. But ethical non-monogamy is something that many healthy, intelligent people engage in willingly, even without the influence of a religion. Is there anything inherently wrong with polygamy between 3 or more consenting adults? If so, what? And if not, why call it out as an example of evil instead of the religious imperative itself? Well, I don't think about polygamy as a problem very much. I think it is a problem in a religious context, whether it's a modern cultic one, or Mormonism, or the traditional one, as you see in various Muslim contexts. It's a problem because it is synonymous with the lowered status of women. There's something coercive about it, there's something misogynistic about it. This is not a freely chosen arrangement on the part of the women, but it's certainly not the worst part of their lives in these cases either, or at least I wouldn't imagine it would be. And I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with non-monogamy. I just think it's most of the time unworkable given the nature of the human mind. People suffer from this complication of their lives intensely for the most part. I haven't heard of it really working. Whenever I meet someone who claims to be in an open relationship, I see a virtual time bomb ticking over their heads. It just tends not to work out, but I'm not at all judgmental about it along ethical lines. As long as it doesn't involve deception, and people are consenting to be in these arrangements, but feel free to have a harem, as far as I'm concerned, man or woman. So I don't think it's a central concern either way, but it's in a religious context, it tends to be part and parcel of the degradation and control of women. Do you think there's a possibility, given advances in technology, you could have your stance changed on free will? I actually don't see how my view about free will could change. And if you're not aware of what I think about free will, I think it's even worse than an illusion. I think the illusion is itself an illusion, which is to say that we think we have an experience of free will, which we don't actually have when we pay close attention. And it makes no sense in third-person neurophysiological terms or physical terms or in any other term. So it's not an ordinary illusion. It's not like it's something's there and then you look more closely and it's gone. If you look closely, you'll find that it's never really quite there. And there's certainly there's no, as I said, there's no way we could describe causality in the world so as to make sense of the conventional notion of free will. I don't see a space for it among our concepts about how concepts operate. You know, we could define it differently. That's fine, especially useful, but people do that, and then we can agree that sort of free will might exist. But what most people mean, libertarian free will, I could have done otherwise in a circumstance. If you rolled back the movie of my life, I could have decided not to answer this question. That is a non-starter, as far as I can tell. So I actually don't see what could conspire to make me change my view here. And that's not true of almost anything else. I could easily specify the terms under which I would believe that Jesus was the Son of God, or that the Quran was the Word of God, or human beings are now going to live 1,000 years old. There's all kinds of amazing things to demonstrate that will change my view of the world. And I can pretty easily come up with the conditions under which that change in view occur. For no free will of my own, I would be hopelessly led to believe something new. But I don't actually see that will happen on the topic of free will. And I would say the same about the existence of the self, the ego, that most people feel they have high and around behind their eyes, in their heads. That's just the other side of the coin.
This is insane. This guy's funny.
Is killing another human being always wrong, even in circumstances such as self-defense? Is there an ethics for killing? Yes. This is something I have read my books. Yeah, I'll defer this to my conversation with Jocko Willem, who will be well placed to talk about the ethics of killing. But the short answer is yes, I think it can be ethical. In fact, I think there are situations where you would be a moral monster for declining to kill someone in defense of yourself, or in particular in defense of some other helpless person. And therefore I think pacifism, while it is generally considered the most refined moral position with respect to violence, I think it's actually an abhorrent position when you look at the details. That's not to say that it's a cowardly one necessarily. Very brave pacifists like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. But I think pacifism, as Orwell pointed out, only works in the presence of a sufficiently civilized enemy. And it's just a guaranteed way to give the world over to the most violent and least scrupulous people. And why would we want to do that? Here's a question. I wonder why you don't use the example of child abuse by Catholic priests as being another case of religious doctrine, in this case forced celibacy, having harmful repercussions in real life. To me, just like jihadism can be linked to certain Islamic doctrines, so can the widespread Catholic sex abuse cases. Further, society's unquestioning respect for religion enabled this for a long time. Even though there are countless examples of religious dogmatism causing harm, I thought this was a pretty good example and might help you to explain you're not unfairly targeting Islam, but highlighting the dangers of dogmatism and unquestioning respect and tolerance of religion above the rule of law. If you do not think this is the same, I would be interested to know why. Okay, well, you certainly can be forgiven for not having read everything I've written, but I can just say I've done this. I wrote a book called Letter to a Christian Nation, which went after Christianity just full bore in a way that I've never quite gone after Islam, at least all in one place. It's true that I ignored the pedophile priest scandal for a while. I don't think I mentioned it in the Letter to a Christian Nation, but at a certain point that stopped. I'll refer you to my essay, Bringing the Vatican to Justice, but I'll give you the first two paragraphs of that so you can get a sense of how I actually haven't ignored the link between doctrine and this problem. Although I should say it's a less direct link than the link between Islamic doctrines around jihad and the problem of jihad. You'll see what I mean. Bringing the Vatican to Justice. I confess that as a critic of religion, I've paid too little attention to the sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. Frankly, it always felt unsportsmanlike to shoot so large and languorous a fish in so tiny a barrel. This scandal was one of the most spectacular own goals in the history of religion, and there seemed to be no need to deride faith at its most vulnerable and self-abased. Even in retrospect, it's easy to understand the impulse to avert one's eyes. Just imagine a pious mother and father sending their beloved child to the church of 1,000 hands for spiritual instruction, only to have him raped and terrified into silence by threats of hell. And then imagine this occurring to tens of thousands of children in our own time, and to children beyond reckoning for over 1,000 years. The spectacle of faith so utterly misplaced and so fully betrayed is simply too depressing to think about. But there was always more to this phenomenon that should have compelled my attention. Consider the ludicrous ideology that made it possible. The Catholic Church has spent 2 millennia demonizing human sexuality to a degree unmatched by any other institution, declaring the most basic, healthy, mature, and consensual behaviors taboo. Indeed, this organization still opposes the use of contraception, preferring instead that the poorest people on earth be blessed with the largest families and the shortest lives. As a consequence of this hallowed and incorrigible stupidity, the Church has condemned generations of decent people to shame and hypocrisy, or to Neolithic fecundity, poverty, and death by AIDS. Add to this inhumanity the artifice of cloistered celibacy, and now you have an institution, one of the wealthiest on earth, that preferentially attracts pederasts, pedophiles, and sexual sadists into its ranks, promotes them to positions of authority, and grants them privileged access to children. Finally, consider that vast numbers of children will be born out of wedlock and their unwed mothers vilified wherever church teaching holds sway, leading boys and girls by the thousands to be abandoned in church-run orphanages, only to be raped and terrorized by the clergy. Here, in this ghoulish machinery set whirling through the ages by the opposing winds of shame and sadism, we mortals can finally glimpse how strangely perfect are the ways of the Lord. So, I'm going to read the rest of it, but let me just plead innocent about ignoring this particular problem. On that happy note, you see I've been at it for a while here. I've bent your ear in none too hopeful directions, mostly. Happy New Year, people.
Additional supply depots required. Additional supply, not enough minerals.
Yes, sir.
If you enjoyed this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can leave reviews on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to listen to it. You can share it on social media with your friends. You can discuss it on your own blog or podcast. Or you can support it directly. And there are 2 ways you can do this. You can leave a donation through my website at samharris.org/donate, or you can try a membership at Audible, the world's leading source of audiobooks, at audibletrial.com/Sam Harris. This podcast is brought to you by Audible, the world's leading source of audiobooks. If you would like to support it, go to audibletrial.com/Sam Harris.
Additional supply, not enough energy. Mineral field depleted.
Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. So today I have something different for you. I have an audiobook preview. The book I did with Majid Nawaz, Islam and the Future of Tolerance, a dialogue, has just been released as an audiobook. And in this podcast you'll hear about a half hour of the audiobook and about a half hour of the postscript that we recorded especially for the release of the audiobook. This postscript was not part of the hardcover, and in it we answer reader questions and talk about how the book has been received and deal with some of our critics. But you'll hear, I hope, that this book was really made to be an audiobook. It is, in fact, a dialogue. Of course, you'll hear the distinction between our reading this dialogue rather than merely producing it extemporaneously. But the fact that we're reading it allows us to be precise, and on this topic, more than many others, I think precision is now the key. In the postscript, we just have a conversation, much more like a podcast conversation, and you'll hear about a half hour of that as well. In any case, this was a hugely gratifying collaboration for me. I'm just so happy to have connected with Majid, to have started this dialogue, to have produced this audiobook and the print edition, and to now be able to call him a friend. It's been a win just across the board for me. Now, unfortunately, I don't think the problems we discuss in this book are going away anytime soon.
Amazing.
I think Majid's voice in particular is going to be increasingly relevant in the years to come. But I'm just very happy to have started this dialogue, and I look forward to collaborating with him in any way that I can in the future that will be useful. And you all can support our efforts by listening to the book or reading it and talking about it or blogging about it and sharing it with others. So now I give you a preview of the audio edition of Islam and the Future of Tolerance, a dialogue by Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz, read by the authors. Majid, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. I think the work you're doing is extremely important. I'm not sure how much we agree about Islam or about the prospects of reforming the faith, and it will be useful to uncover any areas where we diverge. But I want you to know that my primary goal is to support you.
That's very kind of you. I appreciate that. As you know, we are working in a very delicate area, walking a tightrope and attempting to bring with us a lot of people who, in many instances, do not want to move forward. It is very important that we have this conversation in as responsible a way as possible.
Agreed. I'd like to begin by recalling the first time we met, because it was a moment when you seemed to be walking this tightrope. It was, in fact, a rather inauspicious first meeting. In October 2010, I attended the Intelligence Squared debate in which you were pitted against my friends Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Douglas Murray. We met afterward at a dinner with the organizers, participants, and other guests. People were offering short remarks about the debate and otherwise continuing the discussion. And at one point Ayaan said, "I'd like to know whether Sam Harris has anything to say." Although I was well into a vodka tonic at that moment, I remember what I said more or less verbatim. I addressed my remarks directly to you. We hadn't been introduced, and I don't think you had any idea who I was. I said essentially this: Majid, I have a question for you. It seems to me that you have a nearly impossible task, and yet much depends on your being able to accomplish it. You want to convince the world, especially the Muslim world, that Islam is a religion of peace that has been hijacked by extremists. But the problem is, Islam isn't a religion of peace. And the so-called extremists are seeking to implement what is arguably the most honest reading of the faith's actual doctrine. So your maneuvers on the stage tonight, the claims you made about interpretations of Scripture, and the historical context in which certain passages of the Quran must be understood, appear disingenuous. Everyone in this room recognizes that you have the hardest job in the world, and everyone is grateful that you're doing it. Someone has to try to reform Islam from within, and it's obviously not going to be an apostate like Ayaan, or infidels like Douglas and me. But the path of reform appears to be one of pretense. You seem obliged to pretend that the doctrine is something other than it is.
Okay, music time. Jeez, it's pretty late too, though. Gonna stop soon. These are the people I need to play, though. This is what's gonna clean my game up. Because right now I just go over there and kill them, and that's mostly good, but I could do better. That was so weird. I kinda can't believe I let that get out of hand.
Not enough minerals.
When I feel you
Additional supply. Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals. Upgrade complete. Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals.
Yep. SCV ready.
Not enough.
Armed and ready. Been waiting on you. This better be. SCV ready. Gateway coming.
Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals.
SCV ready. Who wants some?
Not enough minerals. Insufficient Vespine gas. Insufficient Vespine gas.
SCV ready.
Insufficient Vespine gas.
Want a piece of me, boy? What's going on? You gonna give me orders? SCV ready. In the rear with the gear.
Add-on complete.
Gotcha. Want some?
Oh my.
SCV ready.
Not enough minerals.
Want a piece of me, boy?
Not enough minerals.
Ah! You hear me? SCV ready. Yeah, whatever. SCV ready.
Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals.
SCV ready. Fire down a piece. Been waiting on you. You got it.
Not enough energy.
Bad news. Go ahead. SCV ready.
Not enough energy.
Big job. I can't build here. In the rear with the gear. Yep.
Add-on complete. Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals. Not enough energy. Not enough. Not enough energy. Not enough minerals.
There's not enough workers on either base.
Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals. Not additional supply depots required. Not enough minerals.
What's going on?
Add-on complete. Additional supply depots required. Additional. Research complete. Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals.
Jesus, Matt.
Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals.
You're such an idiot.
Ready for pickup? Let's go. Here's your
Mineral field.
Wow.
take an apple.
Wow. I'm tired.
Research.
Where's the emergency?
What's going on? In the rear with the gear.
Oh, God.
Not enough minerals. Not enough minerals. Base is under attack. Not enough minerals.
What the fuck is wrong with me?
Not enough minerals. Base is under attack.
Take an apple.
Oh my God. Okay, it's bedtime. Sorry, couldn't win the last one. I'll tell you, I'm finally playing people that I'm kind of as good as. I'm letting them get away with way more than I should, but let's take a look. This was the journey up to where just constant wins. Now the losses are sort of trickling in. This is an awful streak. I'll break this tomorrow. Promise you that. Good night, guys. Take it easy. I will be practicing and playing more. I still love Wings of Liberty. Good night. Take it easy. I will be practicing and playing more. I still love Wings of Liberty. Good night.